Hello out there again, maybe. Feel free to skip this intro if you've been here before and you know what these videos are going to be about. So I highly doubt that there'll be much interest, if any, in these videos, but it was a useful project from my point of view. When I was looking at upgrading my old perpetual version of Lightroom 5.7, which was released way back in 2014. And before going down the Adobe subscription route, because I was very anti-subscription for a long time, hence why I've stuck with Lightroom 5.7 for such a long time, I wanted to just check to see whether there was any other software options out there that would give me the same functionality as Lightroom moving forward. So I explored quite a lot of software, and I'll just scroll through the list again now, just trying to find that software that I might have overlooked in the past, just to see how well they compared to Lightroom. And for this project, I was mainly just interested in seeing what starting positions each of the software that I tried offered up, because obviously in all packages you can edit images to your heart's content to get it to a point that you're happy with to achieve your vision. But for a quick workflow, it would be great if the software rendered your image in a way that was pleasing, so you didn't then have to spend minutes or hours editing the image to get it to where you wanted it to go. The reason why I was considering Adobe in the first place is I wanted to speed up and simplify my workflow, because obviously my old version of Lightroom was no longer compatible with some of the newer cameras I had, certainly not the Fujifilm X-H1. So as I mentioned in this video, which is the precursor to this series of videos, I eventually ended up going with an Adobe subscription, but I didn't really want my thoughts on the software that I trialed to go to waste, hence why I came up with the idea of this series of videos, because hopefully there might be some people out there, hopefully, that are in a similar position to me and want to explore other software options before subscribing to Adobe or Capture One or whatever, just to see what I thought of them, and especially if you haven't got the time or the patience to do a similar exercise in terms of comparing all of these programs. So yeah, I'll briefly talk about my thoughts of the actual programs when I trialed them, in terms of whether I actually liked the software, what I liked, what I didn't like about the software, how it compared to Lightroom, for instance, and the occasional rant about certain software, as well as hopefully some interesting tidbits in there somewhere, maybe. Yeah, so then I'll jump into the comparisons and I'll compare the images, the straight images, so literally just taking it into the software, apply the appropriate starting profile or preset, and then export them out, put them into Lightroom so I can compare them easily with Lightroom's own efforts and with the software that I liked the best in terms of rendering each scene from each camera. And finally, I will add my thoughts on using Adobe Lightroom Classic, because I've been running this project now for nearly a year. So I've been using Adobe Lightroom for about 9 months now. So I will certainly offer up my thoughts on my experiences thus far. So let's get started for the first time, or get on with the comparisons if you've been here before. Right, so on to Iridient X Transformer. This only works, my version only works with Fuji files, and since starting this trial I have 3 iterations of the software to trial, which I can show you the results of, because surprisingly they're not all the same. My original version of Iridient X Transformer, version 1.6.8, I find still works the best with Fuji XE1 files. It's clear cut with XH1 files. They're all identical. Yeah, let's take a look at some of the comparisons and you'll see what I mean. Right, so let's start with Lightroom's version. Then let's start with the oldest version of Iridient. So that's the oldest version of Iridient. And then the second oldest and the third oldest. So you can see they all give completely different results, and hopefully you can see in the YouTube compression that this version 1.6.8 manages to extract the most from the sky. Yeah, so that's the case I find with all of my Fuji X-E1 files. The old Iridient version 1.6.8 is consistently the better version of Iridient X Transformer, and out of all the software I tried, is still the very best at extracting the best from the image. Right, so let's look at the XH1. So let's start again with the original RAW file. Right, so then let's have a look at the oldest version of Iridient, second oldest, third oldest. So as you can see, no change. And I didn't find that Iridient did the best here for the XH1 files. That accolade falls at Luminar's feet, because I just find that it renders the greens in a slightly more pleasing way in this scenario. And then I'll show you again for this particular image. So this is Lightroom's effort. So the oldest version of Iridient I've got, the second oldest, and the third oldest. So again, identical and a pretty good effort, but I prefer another raw therapy. It just seems to be a little more natural in its rendering. So that's Iridient X Transformer. Right, on to Luminar. As a software, I found it was quite slow to export and edit. The worst thing is you can't do other things while it is exporting, whereas with, say, Lightroom, you can export files and then you can still work on other images. With Luminar, you can't do that. It seems to be more preset driven, in that you just apply different presets and see whether you like the effect or not. I did like how clean and simple the user interface was. The AI sky replacement stuff, beyond simple cloning, noise reduction, etc., isn't really for me, but the enhancement tools that it does have are quite powerful. I couldn't find any built-in lens corrections that I could see, although I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with lens correction. Sometimes I find that it enhances an image, sometimes I find that it makes it worse and you lose some of the character of the image. So I don't necessarily apply lens corrections all the time to an image anyway, but it's nice to be able to have them and then turn them on and off so you can see those effects in the first place. And the default settings come out very soft in some instances. However, it's quite a fun tool to use, and some of the tools do remind me a lot like Photolab in the way that they can instantly improve the look of an image. Whether the resultant look is unnatural or fake, I'm undecided upon that, but upon review, the tonality across the board and the sharpness were not up to the standard as some of the other software tools that I tried, in my opinion. And it's a shame that some of the edits don't really occur in real time, so it's difficult to see the effect the changes are having. But I do understand that it's not really trying to compete with the likes of Capture One, Lightroom. It's trying to offer and do things a little bit differently to try and stand out from the pack, offer a different, unique selling point, so to speak. But overall, a good effort from Luminar. So here's the bench image from the Fuji X-H1. So this is Lightroom's Previa rendering of the scene, whereas this is Luminar's. So you can see, and I said it before, it just seems to be able to get a lot more range from the greens that were in the scene, as opposed to Lightroom's efforts, which just all the greens start to blend into one. So let's take a look at some of the other efforts. So let's take a look at some of the XE1 files. So this is the raw file in Lightroom. This is Luminar's effort, so completely dark. And this is my favorite rendering from Iridient X Transformer. Likewise, this is Lightroom. This is Luminar's, a bit of a fake blue. And this is Photolab 6, so a little bit more natural looking in its rendering. So on to a couple of Olympus images. So this is the raw file. This is Luminar's effort, so a lot less contrast. And this is raw therapy's approach to the scenario. So same with this image. This is Lightroom. This is Luminar, which actually does a pretty good job. and this is raw therapy. So you might see here that Luminar does do a pretty good job. You could probably see here what I mean with the lens corrections, because when I switch to raw therapy, the geometry changes in the image. But if I just look at the pixel peeping nature of this particular image, if I zoom into it, you can see again here it's really quite soft in its general rendering, whereas raw therapy here, just with its general default settings, is able to produce a much sharper image. And finally, let's have a look at a Canon 5D image. So this is Lightroom's effort, this is Luminar, and this is my preferred rendering for raw therapy, although Lightroom does do a pretty good job here as well. So Luminar is a little bit flatter, a little bit lower contrast, not quite as good, but not too bad really, comparing it to other software that I've tried in this particular project. So that's Luminar. Yes, this is what the interface to OM Workspace looks like. So I did find that when I was stuck using my old version of Lightroom, that Olympus Workspace, I'm going to call it Olympus Workspace because that's what it was when I used it and not OM Workspace, but I did find that it did do quite often a better job. But I've now found that the newer Lightroom Classic seems to handle images from my old EM1 Mark I much better. So if I just quickly go into Lightroom a minute, so it's stuck to the Olympus files, so this is why I've only got 3 images in the comparison. So this is Olympus Workspace is effort, this is Lightroom, and this is raw therapy. So you can see quite a variation, and I find on the whole that Olympus Workspace is a little lacking in contrast compared to even Lightroom. So again, on this image, this is Lightroom Classic, and I'm still not really that keen on the greens that Lightroom extracts from Olympus EM1 Mark I RAW files. So this is Olympus Workspace, so a little bit better, I'd wager. And this is raw therapy. So it does do the greens a little bit better, raw therapy, but I think the rest of the image does suffer a little bit. And you can see here that Olympus Workspace does maintain a bit more brightness, but I think you do get a bit more natural tonality with raw therapy in this particular image. And not shown here, but Capture One also does a great job with Olympus files. So moving on to the final image. So this is Lightroom's effort. This is my favorite rendering of the scene, which is raw therapy. And this is Olympus Workspace, his effort. So you can see it's not quite as good as raw therapy. Raw therapy seems to extract a lot more detail from the sky. And as I talked about earlier, it just seems to be able to extract from a default position much more detail in the raw file itself. It's just a lot crisper, sharper compared to other software tools that I used. So that is Olympus Workspace. Right, so on to On1 Photo RAW. And again, even though it says it's up to version 2023, when I started this project off, it was 2022.5. So I have included comparisons from both iterations of the software. So that's a little look at what it looks like when you open it up. I no longer have it because it was a trial. Talking about the original version I tried first, so 2022.5, I found it extremely slow to load and in its operation, and it's quite a bloated piece of software compared to other tools that I use. It weighs in at over 2 gigabytes in size, which is quite considerable, but it does have a nice user interface. It is quick to export files. So my thoughts on the image quality in terms of a starting point perspective. Good first impressions, very comparable to the best that I've tried once you lower the exposure compensation to bring down the brightness a little bit, but it does again suffer from being a little bit soft straight off the bat, but real promise. It also has a AI denoise application. It's no noise AI tool. And you can also tweak the effects before applying. So again, you can see the before and after effects that it has on your image. Still a little bit laggy performance wise, but it does have its own take on the Fujifilm simulations, which you can apply. Reality check though, during my trial of the software, I did find myself having to make quite a lot of adjustments to the straight imports, just to get it to match other software's starting positions. I think On1 RAW are trying really to compete more with Luminar and other software out there that offers these AI sky replacement type tools, massive wholesale changes to an image rather than say simple tweaks to sliders to improve a landscape type image, etc. In my opinion, I found its performance extremely slow and frustrating, even with my AMD Ryzen 7 and 16 gig of RAM. So it was a little bit disappointing in terms of its performance. And even though the tonality was pretty good, I didn't really find it to be quite as good as other software again that I tried, and the colors can look a little bit mushy in places. And even though I did like its no noise AI feature, it can give a sense of a too digital, unnatural look to an image rather than a natural representation of a scene. Right, so then in comes On1 RAW 2023. It's now over 2.7 gig, so it's even more bloated than it was before. And again, it seems to be driving towards a more AI future. And as I touched on before, even though I think some AI is good, you know, in terms of improving noise reduction in an image and to improve like cloning or content aware fill, but I'm not keen on making massive wholesale changes. It's not for me. I just prefer keeping an image as honest as I can. So what do you get in 2023 that you didn't get in 2022? Does it justify the cost? Personally, I didn't really see any difference in RAW processing for any of my RAW files. So it wasn't consistently good before. It's no different now. And from my limited time with it, I'm struggling to see any difference compared to the previous version. Its performance was certainly very jittery and laggy for me. Maybe it was rushed out to compete with other software like DxO's Photolab 6. As my project progressed, I did try On1 RAW 2023 again down the line after it had some updates, but I still found that it ran horribly, worse than the previous version, which is very, very frustrating. So yeah, not for me. But let's have a look at some of the images. So XE1, let's start with the RAW file in Lightroom. Then let's have a look at On1 RAW 2022, again using the Previa simulation, and then 2023. So you can see no difference between the two rendering engines. And then this is my preferred version, which is Iridient X Transformer. So you can already see the tonality, I think, and the highlight recovery is a lot better compared to that from On1 RAW. Yeah, so looking at this image, this is Lightroom's effort, and you can see these two, both the 2022 version and 2023 version, no difference. And this is Iridient's effort, which I prefer. So this is Lightroom. This is another RAW therapy, which is my favorite software for this particular scenario. And then let's look at On1 RAW 2022. And I have slightly reduced the exposure compensation here because, like I said, it does produce some overly bright images. And then this again is the 2023 version. And you can see from that it does seem to produce overly bright images. And I've knocked it back there. It doesn't really match or come close to another RAW therapy's rendering of this RAW file scenario. Right, so let's have a quick look at Olympus. So this is Lightroom, this is On1 RAW 2023, and this is RAW therapy. So you can see it's just completely flat. Lightroom, On1 RAW, and raw therapy. So it doesn't do too bad of a job, but I'm not a massive fan of the greens. And then finally, it camified the image. So this is Lightroom. This is On1 RAW 2022, On1 RAW 2023, and raw therapy. So you can actually see it does do a pretty good job. It's just a shame that the software was dog slow. And again, like Photolab, I don't really support software companies that just update the software just for the sake of updating it, when really they could be enhancing the core program and then only charge customers extra when something significantly improves within the product itself. So that's On1 RAW. Right, onto a piece of software called Photo Ninja. The interface is a little weird, old-fashioned almost. Slow to process changes, but quick to load images in a folder. This one had amazing highlight recovery when I tried it with some of my files, perhaps at the expense of contrast. As good, if not better, than other options, but I did find that the noise and the artifacts within the image are quite bad in comparison. It also seems to lose detail when pixel peeping compared to other programs that I tried. It performed well with most of my files and managed to pull a lot of detail from the raw files, but its good run stopped, I found, when I tried using my Fuji X-H1 files with it. It produced some terrible rendering no matter what profile or preset that I tried. So I was going to consider revisiting this software in the future now that I no longer have to worry about Fuji X-H1 files, as I no longer have the camera. Although it doesn't seem like the software is updated anymore. Its last update was over 2 years ago, and if you go on to some photography forums, there was talk from the developers at some point of a Photo Ninja version 2, but nothing seems to have materialized. So I feel like this software package is a little bit dead in the water. So let's take a look at some of the images. So let's start with XE1 files. So this is Lightroom, this is my favorite, Iridient, and this is Photo Ninja. So you can see from that yes, it does do an amazing job at retaining all the highlights in an image, and like I said, at the expense of contrast, although I'm sure you could probably add that back in through the development process. So if we add a bit there, maybe that gets close to then the Iridient's effort. So arguably better, but then not a true starting position. So on to another XE1 file. So that's Lightroom's effort. This is Iridient, my favorite. And this is Photo Ninja. So you can see here that it's not a consistent piece of software in terms of how it renders files, which is a little bit frustrating. So moving on to Olympus. So this is Lightroom, this is Photo Ninja, and that's raw therapy. So you can see, yeah, I prefer raw therapy. Photo Ninja doesn't seem to do that well with greens. So looking at this image, that's Lightroom, that's my favorite, raw therapy. Let's have a look at Photo Ninja. So yeah, not quite as good as raw therapy. And if I look at the details of this one, I use raw therapy's rendering of this scene as my benchmark because it just seems to extract so much detail from the scene. It's just so much sharper and crisper compared to all other software's efforts, including Photo Ninja. So let's look at some XH1 files now. So that's the bench image with Lightroom, Luminar, which I like, the green representation, and then this is Photo Ninja. So it's probably quite, actually in retrospect, I think it does do a better job than Lightroom in this case, but not quite as good as Luminar, which I find a little bit more natural in its rendering. So looking at this image, so that's Lightroom, that's another raw therapy, which is my favorite rendering of this scene, and then Photo Ninja, which is just bleh. So then let's look at some Canon 5D files. So that's the telephone box in Lightroom, that is Raw Therapy, and this is Photo Ninja. So not bad. Photo Ninja just loses a little bit of brightness, which is easily correctable in post. This is Photo Ninja, and that's Lightroom. So again, it does do a pretty good job with 5D files. Not so good with XH1 files, not so good with Olympus files, and a bit hit and miss with XH1 files. But like I said, it did seem to rival Iridient in this particular scene in terms of retaining the highlights in this particular scenario. So that's Photo Ninja. I definitely would revisit this software in the future if it ever did receive another update. Right, so that's the end of this part. I hope some of it is at least interesting or useful to you. Thanks for sticking with it to the end. See you next week for more of the same until this series is done. Bye for now.